Hello and welcome to the Expat Focus podcast. This episode was recorded on the 25th of July 2011. In today's show we're speaking to Becky Grappo. Becky is a well-known expert in the field of international education and the founder of RNG International, a consultancy providing educational advice to those relocating abroad. Becky, welcome to the Expat Focus podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Becky, back in April of this year, I think it was April, we published an interview with you online at the Expat Focus website. For those listeners who haven't had a chance to read that interview, can you give us a bit of background about yourself and what it is you do?
Sure. My background is, first of all, as an educator. I've been an educator for over 20 years and with a unique focus on education, international education. I'm also the spouse of an American diplomat, so that means that we as a family have also been moving around the world for the last 25, 30 years and have lived in 11 different countries with our own 3 children. So my own background, personal background, is as an expat myself, but with professional experience and expertise in the world of education. When I worked within international schools, I had the opportunity to see the inside workings of many different kinds of international schools. And then when we moved back to the United States, I worked in a public school one more time, which is what we call our publicly funded schools. And then I went to work for the U.S. Department of State, where I brought it all together and was the advisor for American diplomatic families moving around the world. So that was kind of the evolution of how I combined my background as an expat with my experience in education. And now I work independently, working with families who are moving around the world with their children as well.
Okay, and tell us a little bit more about the services that you offer.
A lot of people have never even really heard of what an educational consultant is, or let alone what a consultant does. But if you were to sum it up into one easy sentence, I help students and families find the perfect school for them. So what that really means then is being able to find the right kind of school that's going to meet the child's individual educational needs. It's a very personalized approach. It's important to get to know the student extremely well and find out what it is that the child needs so that we can find out how to meet those needs. And some of the students that I have are superstars, and I have other students who are really struggling. It doesn't really matter to me. Each one of them is special, even though they may have completely different learning styles. And then in terms of services, I have services for boarding schools where I can help families find the right boarding school for their child. And then also with college and university applications for American institutions.
All right. I'd like to delve a little bit deeper into the processes that you use. But before we do that, I want to clear up one thing, because I know that there's a phrase which will probably come up, and that's third culture kid, or TCK. Can you tell us what that phrase means and how a third culture kid differs from an international student, for example?
Great question. Well, the definition that I like the best is the one that is used in the book. I believe it was first coined by Ruth Useem, and then it's used again in the book Third Culture Kids Growing Up Among Worlds that was co-authored by David Pollack and Ruth Van Reken. And that is, I'm going to summarize it in my own words. Let's take a child who is born in one country. Parents may have the same passport or different passports themselves, and then the child is moved to a different country and maybe multiple countries. So therefore, they're going to be absorbing elements from all the cultures that they experience. And because this is occurring during their developmental years, it has a pretty profound impact on the way they see the world. And usually when we talk about third culture kids, we find that they have an affinity towards every culture that they have experienced, but they don't really feel like they belong in any of the cultures 100%. So therefore, the people that they're going to gravitate towards are going to be other kids who've had a similar experience growing up abroad.
Okay, and I'll come back at a later stage in this interview and ask you whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But let's move on to two more practical issues to begin with. When a family needs to think about schooling abroad for the first time, where should they begin? What are the first things they need to think about right at the start of the process?
That's a great question as well, because when I worked at the State Department, and I used to get people calling me all the time, these are diplomats who would have what we call the bid list, and that means here's a list of places that are open around the world and the jobs that are available, and the family would call me and say, what do I do? And so obviously one of their primary concerns was going to a place that was going to have the schooling that they needed for their children. So the first thing I told families, and I still tell families, is you have to assess what it is that your children need. Now, if you have one child, you only have to think about one, but every child in the family is going to be different. And so therefore, you're not only trying to meet the needs of one, but all the children in the family. And that sometimes is very difficult, especially if there are any exceptionalities. So that could mean a child that is highly gifted. That could mean a child that has some learning disabilities. That might be a child that has a special talent or a sport that they want to continue to pursue when they're overseas. And so finding a school that's going to meet the needs of each member of the family is not always easy. The other thing I think is they have to look at the length of the assignment. So are they going on a semi-permanent basis? Are they going for just a couple of years? Is it open-ended? How long will the kids get to stay? So this is particularly important as the students are entering their secondary school years or high school in preparation for university. You want to make sure that they have the chance to have some continuity there, not only academically, but hopefully with their friends as well. And then I think you have to look at the schools at the destination and find out how well they are going to be able to meet the needs of each member of the family. And then lastly, I think you have to look at the long-term goals. So what is the goal at the end? Once they've finished school, where are they going to go on? Are they going to go on for further education? What will they want to study? And will they be ready for that next step based on the decisions that you're making today? So it's a puzzle. And it's great when it works out for every member of the family. But sometimes this is so complicated when we're moving around the world that we can meet the needs of most members of the family, but maybe not 100%. And then that's when we have to really stop and take a hard look at whether or not we want to continue the assignment or whether we're going to look for a different kind of schooling option for that particular child.
Right. So knowing what direction the education is going to take and identifying that end goal, that's the first thing people need to do.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
And once they've done that, then what are the practical steps that they can take to find the school that meets those child's needs? Should they employ someone like yourself? Should they go onto the internet and research? Should they speak to other parents? What should they be doing, do you think?
Oh, I think there are multiple steps that they could be doing. Definitely there are consultants like myself who are out there who can help them sift through some of the options that they would find at Post. I have a long checklist of things that I advise my clients to be looking for when they're looking at an international school, and it goes far beyond the surface with detailed questions that they need to be asking. And I think this is also where it's helpful that I have worked in international schools. So I'm looking at things like, for example, the professional development that their teachers have and where the teacher's been trained and what is the teacher turnover and who is actually administering the school. And a host of other questions like that go beyond the bricks and mortar and what you might see on the surface, because I want to know how well qualified and trained the teachers are, how committed they are, what is their morale, are they happy to be there, are they happy every day that they walk into the classroom and see those kids. Magic can happen under a tree. You don't have to have the biggest and most beautiful building, but if you don't have the basic elements in place, then that child might have a very difficult year. The other thing I think is really important is that parents have to be very honest with themselves about what their individual child's needs are, and then they have to be honest with the schools. Because I also see families sometimes not want to tell schools everything that there is to know about that child for fear of not being accepted. But then, is that what you really want? Because then you might have your child in a situation which isn't going to be good for them. In a way, they're kind of set up for failure or not being as successful as they need to be. So I think those are some of the things that are really important when looking at an international school or local school even.
So being honest with yourself and being honest about the child, about strengths and weaknesses is obviously important.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the different types of schools. I know we talked so far just about international schools mostly, but broadly speaking, what are the benefits and disadvantages of international schools versus local schools, shall we say?
Well, I think that's an important question, especially as some of the expat packages have started reducing the amount of fees that will be reimbursed for a family. And so some families are taking a closer look at some of the local school options. I think there are a lot of things to take into consideration. There are some families that deliberately and intentionally want their child to be in the local school. And that is, first of all, I think because of the acculturation issues for acquiring another language, for really being able to make friends and immerse themselves in another culture. And those are all admirable reasons. I think that if they do that, they need to be thinking about cultural differences and how they could play out. That could be a very interesting scenario as they move along. And then I think they have to also be thinking about the ages of the students. I think that works easier when the children are younger. It becomes more difficult as they get older. It depends on how long they're going to be there and whether or not they'll be able to see it through to the end. And then if they do see it through to the end, then where are they going to go to university and make their life? I see that with a lot of expats. I think also thinking about the local school, it could be that in some places the education is going to be incredible and incredibly rich. And so going and immersing their children in the local school is going to be a fantastic experience for them. And other places, it could be that the educational standards are not quite what they wanted. It could be that the approach isn't what the parents had expected. I think it's important to take a good look at how the school approaches discipline for children, and especially the way they enforce discipline and talk to the children. Sometimes there can be some cultural differences between the way they approach children and the way other cultures approach children. So that's important to make sure that you're comfortable with it. And then there are national schools in other countries. So, for example, you can almost always find an English school. You can almost always find a French baccalaureate school. Many places you'll find a German school, American international schools, Australian schools. It depends on where you're going, but you can also find those national curriculum schools being operated in other countries. I say that with a caveat. The United States doesn't have a national curriculum. But anyway, and then there are for-profit schools and not-for-profit schools, and I think that's also extremely important because there are a proprietary school sometimes will have a different goal to their institution. And it's very important for parents to understand that from the very beginning and to talk to a lot of different people about whether or not that's going to be the right approach for them. Some of the not-for-profit schools are operated by an elected school board and have a not-for-profit status. And so that's something else that parents might want to take a closer look at.
Okay, it's not an easy choice, is it? There's a lot to think about there, obviously.
Exactly.
Okay, let's come back to the issue of curriculum. Can we talk a little bit about examinations and qualifications? How transferable are qualifications obtained abroad when a family decides to return home or to move to another country? Do students need to be aiming for an international qualification which is obviously transferable, or are local qualifications after some negotiation and thought actually in practice transferable to other schools and other educational curriculums? So how difficult and complicated is that sort of issue?
Whoa, that's a loaded question. I could talk for an hour about that particular topic.
Okay.
Okay.
We'll come back and do another show just on that.
Okay. I'll try to make it really brief. So let's say, for example, let's talk about going back to the United States. If a child has been in a local school and goes to the United States, when they go to enroll in the public school system, they will be going to the International Student Office, which has experience in evaluating transcripts and assessing what level they might be at. And that's where you might find that there is some gaps and overlaps between what the kids have been doing overseas and what they're going to be doing in the U.S. And so therefore it could also affect grade placement or class placement. I think one reason why a lot of families, expat families, gravitate towards a school like an English school, French school, German school, American school, etc., is because of transferability of curriculum and credits. so that as they move around the world, if they can find another British school, for example, they can usually slide in fairly easily and the kids can pick up where they left off without any huge interruptions to their education. Same thing mostly with the French, German, and American, Australia, etc. However, there are some huge differences, and then we have to think about Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere. And then, I think it would be very interesting to have a longer conversation about the International Baccalaureate, because I think a lot of families think that because it is an internationally known program, that it would be very easy, for example, to interrupt a child's education in the secondary level with maybe 1 year of the IB program in one school and the second year of the IB program in another school in another country.
That's always been my assumption as well, but you're going to go on and say that's wrong.
It's not easy. It's possible, but not easy, because there are customizations of the IB program depending on where it's going to be implemented. So therefore, you can't make any assumptions, and you can't make any assumptions that the continuation of the class that a student needs is going to be offered at the next location. Even if it's, for example, I had a student once who was evacuated out of a very prominent American international school that had a very strong IB program, and he was probably the top student in the class. But he was taking so many higher level IB courses his senior year that when he was evacuated because of political unrest and had to come back to the United States, even though we found an IB program in a public high school for him in the U.S., I could only get him a 50% match on the courses that he needed.
Right.
So, he wasn't able to duplicate what it was that he was doing overseas.
Okay. There's clearly a lot to talk about here. Let's save that, if we can, if it's okay with you, for another interview, and we'll go in some detail into that. All right, let's move on. Let's say we've got a family who's identified the direction that they want education to take. They've identified a suitable school. What then are the practical challenges they face at that stage? Are there typically, and I suppose I'm mostly talking about international schools here, are there typically assessment procedures to go through, for example, or could there be long waiting lists? Or what are the hurdles that parents need to overcome at that final stage just to get the child into the school?
Well, it depends on the school and the location and the enrollment pressures that school is facing right now. I think, first of all, you have to contact the school and have a conversation with the registrar. If there are any particular needs that your child has, I think it's very important to talk to the key players. So say, for example, you have a child with a learning difference. It would be very important to talk to the school counselor, the person who's in charge of special education, if there is a program, as well as the registrar, just about getting the papers. Then, of course, you fill out the papers. You have to find out if the school has any entry-level tests that are requirements. How are they going to sit for those tests? How are they going to be placed for classes? Is there a waiting list? Is there, now in some locations, because of enrollment pressures, corporations have purchased seats in a particular school. So you have to find out as well whether or not you're going to purchase a seat. Here's a very important point. A family that's it hasn't done this before may think, well, you know what, we'll try out this school, and if it doesn't work, we'll move and go to another one. But a lot of these international schools have an upfront fee that you pay for enrollment, development, whatever you want to call it. But it's a pretty hefty fee just to enroll in the school in addition to the tuition. So if you're going to school hop, every time you change schools, you're going to have to pay that big upfront fee one more time again. So it does pay to think through the choice very carefully before you make that final decision, but you can't wait too long either, because then you might lose the place that you need for your child.
Right. Okay. Well, let's stick with the subject of money just for 1 second. Is it the case that international schools are only affordable for expats who are particularly well off, or do they fall within the reach of the middle income expat as well? I know you mentioned some expats are maybe on employment packages where the education costs are paid for by the company. Is that typical? Is that what you're seeing most of the time? And can you give us a very rough idea of costs? I know it must differ very greatly from one school and one country to the next, but any sort of rough idea of yearly costs would be useful, I think.
That would be impossible to pin down because it really depends on the country.
Right.
I mean, if you're talking about Western Europe, you're talking about incredibly hefty fees, annual fees for tuition. If you're talking about a developing country, it's going to be much less. But here's something I think is a benchmark, and that is that if it is going to be a top-tier international school, these are some of the fixed costs. You're going to have not only the building itself, but you're going to have the staff. If the staff is highly qualified and coming from the countries that you're looking for in terms of professional training, they're going to need to be paid a certain level of compensation in order to remain competitive, in order to attract the most talented teachers. And that package is going to include housing, airfare, medical, some retirement benefits, and some professional development money as well. So you can't, then the other thing that you want to see in the school is, at least what would be important to me, is that I want to see that the school is well equipped, that they've got up-to-date textbooks and lab equipment and the specials and the technology, et cetera, et cetera. And all that takes money. And so if it gets too down to the bones in terms of tuition, they are not going to be able to provide the kinds of services that one would expect in a let's say a Western developed country. So, and that's also where the for-profits motive comes in as well. I mean, you want to make sure that the tuition fees could be very high, but where is the money being spent? And is it being spent on staff and supplies for the school? So that's why I'm saying it's important to look beneath the surface.
Okay, so it's not just the case that expats need to think, can I afford to pay for the education? They also need to ask themselves, can the school afford to deliver a good education as well?
Absolutely. That's right. That's right. And if a family has a certain budget that they have to work with, then they need to look at the local options and say, okay, how is this going to play out for my child? Is this going to be, am I going to be happy if my child is in this school? And will this be a good experience for my child? Or based on the allowance they're giving me, and this is the option that I'm going to be able to afford for my child, do I still want to accept this?
Let's wrap up with maybe one final question. It's clearly important for the child to get the right education. That much is obvious. How important is it for the family as a whole? And again, I come back to this idea about the third culture kids and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. So how important is it for the family, both at the time that the education is ongoing, but also 5, 10, 20 years into the future? What effect can the right or the wrong choices have further down the line?
I think they can have profound impact on the student down the line, on the child down the line. I think there are many, many wonderful things that can come with living internationally. And I think that would be another topic as well. What are some of the benefits of growing up internationally? Mm-hmm. And what are the benefits that the children have by being exposed to so many different cultures and ways of thinking and ways of doing things? And obviously those benefits can be enormous. But it is not an easy life. And sometimes I think parents and families are faced with some pretty tough choices. And I think that anybody who goes into this thinking that it's always going to be a bed of roses is going to become disillusioned. It's not always easy. And sometimes there are hard choices. And every family, I think, does the best that they can with the information that they have at hand. But I think the message I really want to get across to parents is that a child's social emotional health is almost, or it is equally as important as their academic progress. And so if a child is making academic progress, but their social emotional health is suffering, then we've got some problems. And if we have a child who's suffering with a social or emotional issue, it doesn't have an adequate peer group, it has maybe some mental health issues, the academics don't really matter. You've got to have a healthy child before the academics even matter. And because I deal with a lot of kids who are struggling, I see sometimes the flip side of what's going on, what happens in this internationally mobile lifestyle. So my message to parents is that we have to take it seriously. We have to think it through very, very carefully. Children are resilient. We want our kids to be resilient. But we also want to be thinking about their best interests at all times, and we don't want to make a quick decision without thinking everything through in great detail. And sometimes that's what I do with the family is, they don't need a lot of services. They just need someone that they can talk it through with and have someone ask them the right questions. And that's what I can do for a family as well.
Great point. Great point. Becky, I think we're just about out of time. Thanks once again for joining us. Will you come back and talk to us again?
I would love to. Thank you.
Great. And just before we go, how do people get in touch with you if they want to learn more about what we've discussed today?
Well, the best way is through email because I travel quite a bit. So my email address is Rebecca, Rebecca, at Rebecca Grappo, GRAPPO.com. And my website is www.rebeccagrappo.com. And once you're on my website, then you can see all those familiar icons to Facebook, Twitter, my blog, et cetera, et cetera. So if you'd like to follow what I'm doing and thinking and finding and discovering that I think is of interest, then I welcome everyone to join me on those social media networks. And if you ever want to talk about something, somebody can just send me an email.
Becky, wonderful. Thank you very much once again. We look forward to speaking to you in the future.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.